Let's take a look at knight f6, bishop g5. Many different variations have evolved from this position, especially in the first decades of the 20th century, when the Queen's Gambit declined, reigned supreme in the world of chess openings. Most of these lines have now been practically forgotten. Black has, for instance, the possibility 4c5, which is called the Semi-Tarrasch Defense. C takes d5. C takes d4, called the Dutch Gambit or the Dutch Peruvian Gambit, due to the Peruvian player Canal's alternative idea, 5 queen to b6. So instead of c captures, is queen to b6 here. Interesting. The Queen's Gambit declined, Semi-Tarrasch Canal variation. This was still moderately popular as late as the 1950s, but has now been reduced to a footnote. Then there is the older, still, Cambridge Springs variation, which is less risky and fairly popular to this day. It can be reached either by playing 4 knight on b to d7. All right, let's go back. Oh, sorry, bishop g5 and then 4 bishop on b to d7, e3, c6, knight to f3, queen to a5. Yep. The Queen's Gambit declined, Cambridge Springs defense. All right. Or by 4c6, c6, e3, knight on b to d7, knight f3, and then queen to a5. Black unpins his king's knight and prepares the aggressive moves, bishop to b4 and knight to e4, both of which should not be underestimated. Yeah. White's most cautious reply, 7 knight to d2, knight to d2. So I don't even see it in the opening list here. Oh, it's the top one, sorry. Queen's Gambit decline, Cambridge Springs defense. All right, so knight to d2. White's most cautious reply is 7 knight to d2, whereupon black has two options. D takes c4, which is actually the second most popular move, and is called the Queen's Gambit declined, Cambridge Springs Rubinstein variation. Two options. D takes c4 more or less forces the exchange of bishop takes f6, knight takes f6, after which many players, satisfied with this achievement, will be happy to withdraw their queen. After knight takes c4, queen to c7. The other option, instead of d takes c4, is bishop to b4, queen to c2, castle kingside, bishop to e2, and now either c5 or e5, continuing the attack. A sharper reply is for white to, instead of knight to d2, is 7 c takes d5. All right. Which is called the just the regular Queen's Gambit decline, Cambridge Springs defense. C takes d5. Knight takes d5. With the black queen on a5, e takes d5 would produce an inferior version of the exchange variation. Yep, all right. The remaining knight takes d5. 8 queen to d2. White is prepared to sacrifice the pawn that will be lost after bishop b4, rook c1, knight on 7 to b6, followed by knight to a4 in order to take over the initiative. This approach is perhaps the most feared nowadays, although its consequences are far from clear. Black also has 8 knight on 7 to b6, all right? So instead of bishop b4, knight on 7 to b6. So bishop to b4 actually is called the Yugoslav variation, and knight on 7 b6 is also called the Yugoslav variation. Okay, second most popular. Black also has 8 knight 7 b6, immediately bringing the second knight into the assault on c3. Yep. When white also tends to sacrifice a pawn by bishop d3, knight takes c3, b takes c3, knight to d5, and castle. All right, so in practice, many players avoid the Cambridge Springs by transposing to the exchange variation with c takes d5 on move 5 or 6. Let's see. Exchange variation move 5 or 6. Let's go to 5. I see. So instead of e3, just immediately captures. Or after e3, then you capture. Okay. All other variations at black's disposal start with 4 bishop e7. Okay. So instead of c6, 4 bishop e7. Just like 3 knight to f6, this is a solid natural move. Black is not in a hurry to try to take over the initiative and simply develops his pieces instead. e3, castle kingside, knight to f3. This is the starting point for all variations which are based on bishop e7, on 4 bishop e7. In the course of well over a century, the following can be said to have evolved as the main lines. Knight on b to d7, okay, or h6, bishop h4, knight to e4, okay, or h6, bishop h4, b6, and then h6, knight, bishop captures f6. Interesting. So if we look at h6 is called the neo-orthodox variation. Knight on b to d7, which is the first recommendation, is the orthodox defense. b6 is the modern variation. c6 is the semi-Slav defense anti-Marin gambit, the anti-Marin gambit. Knight to e4 is the modern variation. All right, so talk about the oldest of these is knight on b to d7. After white's most common reply, 7 rook to c1, black may choose 7 c6, bishop d3, d takes c4, bishop takes c4, knight to d5. The Capablanca variation. Chess.com calls it the Queen's Gambit declined orthodox Capablanca system. Here we touch upon some of the bedrock theory of the Queen's Gambit declined. It has remained virtually unchanged since the 1920s, yet it is still alive and very interesting. The point is that after the plausible 10, bishop takes e7, queen takes e7, castle kingside, knight takes c3, rook takes c3. Black continues with 12 e5. When he has reached a very acceptable position without any weaknesses. White has tried just about everything to hold on to at least a minimum of initiative. One option is the forcing 13, d takes e5, knight takes e5, knight takes e5, queen takes e5, and f4, which has been worked out very deeply. Theory's present favorite, however, seems to be 13 queen to c2. E takes d4, E takes d4. That is the Queen's Gambit decline orthodox Capablanca Vidmar variation. Goodness. Interesting. So in this, white has an isolated d pawn, but has more central control, has the pieces developed, castled. Black needs to develop this bishop. White definitely has an initiative, but is it enough with the weakness of d4? Probably eventually going to trade it by pushing it. But is there much there? Interesting. All right, so very closely related to the Capablanca variation is 6h6. So instead of knight on b to d7, h6. Bishop h4, knight to e4. All right, Queen's Gambit declined the Lasker defense. Here too, Black aims for a fairly uncomplicated middle game by exchanging some minor pieces. In some cases, the similarities with Capablanca's idea are astonishing. For instance, after bishop takes e7, queen takes e7, rook to c1, c6, bishop d3, knight takes c3, rook takes c3, d takes c4, bishop takes c4, knight to d7, castle, and e5. The only difference from the line given above is that Black's pawn is on h6 instead of h7. That is interesting. I wonder if that changes anything. I guess there's less of a weakness if queen and then bishop. But actually it can reduce a weakness now by playing queen to d3 and then bishop back. Okay. A good alternative plan is 13 bishop b6 instead of e5. 13 b6 for black. Perhaps the most principled approach is to play 9 c takes d5. Let's go to 9. So instead of rook c1, the principled approach would be c takes d5 instead of rook c1, forcing the exchange on c3. After knight takes c3, b takes c3, e takes d5. White is a very sound strategy in queen to b3, followed by c4, gaining a nice central pawn majority. Black's reasons for allowing this are the open lines, which allow him an easy and active development of his pieces. Both these variations are old and respectable and still quite fashionable, but the real main line of the Queen's Gambit declined is now, all right, I'm going to move 6. h6, bishop h4, and b6. Chess.com calls it the Queen's Gambit declined, the Tartakower Defense, the Tartakower, and this is called the Tartakower variation. This gives rise to much more complex positions than both the Capablanca and the Lasker variation have to offer, while retaining about the same degree of reliability, a very fortunate combination of characteristics which makes the Tartakower very attractive indeed. In fact, there's hardly a world-class player nowadays who has never played it. White has tried a great number of ideas to gain at least a minimal opening advantage, often extremely subtle, and sometimes involving a clear move order, to execute a standard plan in a new form. Or a clever move order to execute a standard plan in a new form. Basically, White has 3 different plans at his disposal. The first is to leave black in peace and to concentrate instead on developing as actively as possible. This attitude may result in a variation like bishop d3, bishop b7, castle kingside, knight on b to d7, queen e2, c5, rook on f to d1. The tension in the center may be resolved at any moment, but how? The strategy is intrinsically sound, but it does require some accuracy and good positional skills in order to be really effective. The second plan is to do precisely the opposite. White fixes the central pawn formation immediately by playing 8 c takes d5. All right, let's see. So instead of bishop d3, it's c takes d5. This was the main line of the Tartakower until about 1970, but when it became increasingly clear that knight takes d5, bishop takes e7, queen takes e7, knight takes d5, e takes d5 is entirely playable for black. Mainly because of this discovery is that after rook on c1, the somewhat surprisingly bishop to e6, most popular move, they call it the Queen's Gambit declined Tartakower Makhno exchange variation, the Makhno exchange variation. Bishop e6 is much stronger than bishop b7. The popularity of this line for white dwindled. 11 bishop to e6 leaves black free to use the open b file after bishop e2, c5, d takes, b takes, castle, knight to d7 for his rooks. Chances are considered equal here. Yeah, looks about 28 games. White played queen to a4 here. And just a few other alternatives was queen to c2 and queen to d2. Also knight to e1 was tried and bishop to b5. The third plan, and the most popular one nowadays, is actually a refinement of the second. White waits for bishop to b7. All right, 8, bishop to b7. So on move 8, instead of c captures, white can play bishop d3, bishop e2, rook to c1, or queen to b3. So he's waiting for bishop to b7, and then he exchanges bishop for knight on f6, and then only then does he take on d5. Huh. All right, so let's see. So let's do bishop e2. And then bishop b7. Exchange bishop for knight f6. And then exchanges, and then he takes on d5. In this type of middle game, it is much more difficult for black to free his position by means of c5. And if he does not achieve this pawn break, he runs the risk of ending up a slightly passive, if still fairly solid position. Naturally, by giving up the bishop pair, white does take a certain amount of long-term positional risk. So this strategy, popular though it is, does require a steady hand. The reader may have noticed that both the Lasker and the Tartakower variation are given here as starting with 6h6. Yep, let's see. This is played simply because in many of the resulting positions, h6 turns out to be a useful move for black. Inevitably, the attempt to punish black for this insertion by not retreating the bishop and going for bishop takes f6 instead has also been investigated. Very similar to the above-mentioned third plan against the Tartakower, white gives up the bishop pair in order to make it more difficult for black to get c5 in. At the same time, a b6 setup, for instance, bishop takes f6, let's say rook c1, b6, is discouraged because white will then normally be just a tempo ahead of a regular Tartakower. This means that black will have to think about other methods of tackling the opening problems. 4 main lines have been developed, all based on white's choice of move after bishop takes f6. These lines are very subtle and need a good deal of positional understanding, but basically they all fit into the simple schedule. White chooses a move to make c5 as unattractive as possible. Then black reacts in such a way as to demonstrate that white has made the wrong choice. So, after rook to c1, an enormously popular move around 1985 was c6, and then bishop d3, knight on b to d7, castle kingside, d takes c4, bishop takes c4, and then e5 is the main line. And this is called the Queen's Gambit declined neo-Orthodox anti-Tartakower Petrosian variation. Now on 8 queen to c2, 8 queen to c2, intended to make castling queenside possible, black turns out to be able to play the much longed for c5 anyway, mainly because of the fearless pawn sacrifice d takes c5. You can still play c5 because the pawn sacrifice d takes c5. Yeah. Okay. Subtly different from this is 8 queen to d2. Also with a view to castling queenside, is met by d takes c4, bishop takes c4, knight to d7, with c5 to follow. Perhaps white's most forceful move, though not necessarily the strongest, is 8 queen to d3. Sorry, 8 queen to b3, attacking black's pawn on d5. Yep, we got a lot attacking. In that case, black will have to look for a specific way to take advantage of the exposed position of the white queen, such as 8c6, rook to d1, knight to d7, bishop to d3, and now queen to b6, a5, and rook to b8, intending b5 after that, have all been played.